margins of the United Nations General Assembly, where the focus has very much been on the Sustainable Development Goals, the development agenda, as the deadline towards the 2030 agenda looms large with only 7 years to go. And part of the discussions here have been around financing for development and the catalytic effect that finance must play in, particularly for developing countries, in the implementation of the goals that are lagging. Only 15% of the targets have been met so far, so a big concern around financing. Part of that discussion, the illicit flows of capital from Africa, and an intervention yesterday by former South African President Thabo Mbeki in his capacity as chair of the high-level AU panel on illicit financial flows. Former President Mbeki, welcome to New York. Welcome back to SABC. It's always good to have a conversation with you, sir.
Thanks, Sherwin.
So, your address to the meeting on financing for development, you sought to make a direct link between the illicit financial flows out of Africa and SDG implementation on the continent, particularly Goal 1, which is the eradication of poverty. And Mr. President, with an estimated $88 billion leaving the continent illicitly on an annual basis, one really begins to appreciate the significant impediment this represents to the continent's development, not so?
Well, certainly a matter that was raised quite sharply, correctly, as the UN were preparing for the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, was of course a discussion at the International Conference on Financing for Development in Addis Ababa. And a very important matter raised there was this matter about domestic resource mobilization. That it was very, very important that all of us, member states of the United Nations, should focus on that matter to generate these resources to attain in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So it was in that context that on the African continent we decided to look at this matter about illicit financial outflows out of the continent. Because those would be part of the domestic resources that we would use on the continent for the purpose of this achieving these development goals, and indeed found that substantial sums of money were leaving the continent. Unfortunately, that matter then we put it to the Addis Ababa conference, and they agreed that the matter must be dealt with. We put it to the United Nations General Assembly, and so the matter about combating the illicit financial outflows is part of Agenda 2030. So therefore, when there was a review, as has happened now, as you have indicated, with the General Assembly looking at the matter as to where are we with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, the matter of resources had to arise. Resources not only in the sense of dealing with those illicit financial flows, but the resources generally. For instance, matter raised very sharply by many people.
Right.
Of the reform of the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, and even the leaders of the IMF, World Bank themselves came and said, yes, we agree, there needs to be reform. It relates to the matter of the generation of the resources needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
So there's a sense, Mr. President, that there's growing consensus. So let's help our viewers understand what we mean when we talk about illicit financial flows, right? Some of the ways these funds are exiting the continent is through trade misinvoicing, tax abuse, cross-border corruption, transnational financial crime, money laundering, loopholes in global finance. And those are some of the things that the General Assembly, as you mentioned yesterday, the second committee of the General Assembly that deals with economic and financial issues, so they are trying to look at this matter. They seek to promote inclusive and effective tax cooperation at the United Nations. How would you like to see the General Assembly take this matter forward, particularly in the context of your call for greater international tax cooperation? How can this be a game changer?
No, you see, as I said, that we put on the global agenda as Africans the matter of combating the illicit financial outflows. And it was agreed by everybody. The question, of course, that arises is what is to be done to achieve that? And clearly then already we had said the matter about dealing with the taxation is important, because in our own investigation we found that at least two-thirds to deal with that globally. So as Africans, we said it's important to have a system of taxation, which is decided upon by the United Nations. So the General Assembly agreed to that, second committee, as you say, last year, and asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to say that, having agreed that there must be a system of taxation undertaken by the United Nations, what is to be done? And so the Secretary General has presented his report on that matter, so that we were responding to that. To say that, yes, first of all, it's the United Nations that must deal with this matter. The only inclusive, thoroughly inclusive multilateral body in the world is the UN. So in order to include everybody, you take into account everybody's interest, it must be done by the United Nations. As you know, there was an argument that it must be done by the OECD, but we're saying no, the OECD is a small group of countries, important economically, but they are not inclusive. And so the UN is the best body. That's what we said yesterday.
So while inclusivity is important, let me push you, Mr. President. Sometimes multilateral institutions come up with really great frameworks that are not implemented. An example of that is the Sustainable Development Goals. So my concern is that while they might come up with an international framework, it's going to be left to individual countries really to arrest this matter. I mean, what can national jurisdictions really do in the absence of this international framework now to start arresting the situation?
Let's finish with this thing. You see, we are agreed. Fortunately, the UN agreed, yes, there must be legislation on taxation. There must be legislation on taxation. I'm saying the legislation because it's agreed. The option that the Secretary General proposed, which we supported, which is an option 2, says that it must be binding. So the option that must be negotiated by the UN and agreed, as proposed by the Secretary General, in terms of this international tax system, that it must be binding on all member states of the United Nations.
Which is unique in the context of the UN, binding.
Sure.
Especially out of the General Assembly, right?
But that is what is being proposed even by the Secretary General. And that's what we supported. We said this option that is proposed, which is an option 2, it must be a binding international convention on tax.
So what's your reading of the consensus around that?
Well, I think the majority of the member states of the UN, in terms of our understanding, are agreed about that. It's not all. There's still a view that this matter is better dealt with by an organization such as the OECD. But the majority opinion, it clearly is, let it be via the UN, and let it be a binding convention on these international taxes. Because huge sums of money are leaving everywhere in the world.
Right.
And many of them, in trillions of dollars, are getting into tax havens. So even the developed countries are themselves losing revenues because of the outflows which end up in the tax havens. So here nobody knows how much is there, owned by whom, not tax-free and all of that. The law would be able to deal with matters of that kind.
What about the question of justice, right? I mean, if you look at the legacy of this issue, this has been happening annually. We're talking about 88 billion a year, which means trillions have been leaving the continent in just one decade. Can that money ever be repatriated to the nations it was taken from?
Well, I doubt it, but I think we need...
It was taken from?
Well, I doubt it, but I think we need to deal with this matter of these outflows in a very firm manner. And this international legislation coming out of the UN system, binding on all member states, will be very important in that regard, so that we stop losing these billions, because the companies are able to create all manner of loopholes so that they don't pay the necessary taxes in the countries where they are busy, they are active in business. So it's a very important decision. We're arguing that indeed it's this 78th session of the General Assembly that must act on this matter.
That must get this done.
That must get it done, must get moving. And hopefully the lady who chaired our session, indeed that's how she summarized.
Yeah, with 7 years to go before the 2030 deadline, This is a matter of great, great importance. Mr. President, a few questions on some other matters. It's a coincidence that we speak today on the 21st of September, the day you announced your resignation as President of the Republic some 15 years ago. Are there any personal reflections you might have at this time that you might share with us as you look back now? Your concerns you've expressed about South Africa at times, your work on the continent since leaving office. I'm going to leave that to you. Take us where you will.
No, not concerns about what happened then in 2008, but concerns about South Africa today. Because it's very clear that the many things are wrong. Many things are negative, whether you talk about the economy, employment, security, crime.
Implementation of the SDGs.
Implementation of the SDGs, quite right, and all of that. We as South Africans need to say we need to turn the corner with regard to all of that. We need to do certain things so that the economy grows rather than declines, that crime declines rather than continues growing. You know, all of those negative things. I had thought, for instance, in 2020, that we had arrived at a very good point when all of the social partners were basically saying the same thing. Let's end this unemployment and this declines in the economy and all of that by acting together as social partners. And therefore, let's conclude a social compact which would address the following things. That was 2020. Nothing has happened. Nothing has moved. In terms of that social compact, the capacity of the South Africans to act together to address the common challenges, whether you are government or business or labor or whatever, nothing has moved. That's what we need to attend to. Why are we not acting?
Because there is this national development plan that is not being implemented, right?
There was never a plan to implement the development plan. The national development plan is a vision. That's all. It calls itself a plan. The national development is in fact a vision. This is what South Africa would like South Africa to look like by the year 2030. But there was no plan to give effect to that dream, to that vision. So we need a real, actual plan.
What does turning the corner mean when you talk about South Africans in that context? What must they do to turn the corner? You're talking about elections.
Let me give you one example. In terms of the social compact, it was agreed by government, labor, business, everybody, civil society, that the matter about infrastructure investment would be a very important part of the process of the resurrection of the South African economy, infrastructure investment. The current situation that we have is that the managed people who are holding the savings, are saying we are ready to invest in infrastructure. The problem is that the government is not producing the infrastructure projects. So no infrastructure projects. Originally, the government said it's because we have no capacity, and the private sector lent them some people, but there have been no infrastructure projects coming, bankable, of an investable kind. So that's why I'm saying, I'm giving an example of this.
Sure.
So indeed, we need to act. Let's address whatever the shortfalls are in government to produce these projects. And then indeed, let the private sector meet its obligation of making the funds that it has. It says we have money, we don't need money from outside the country in order to put into those infrastructure projects. So let's produce the projects and let the private sector also meet its commitment to make the money available for that.
When people hear about infrastructure investment, the first thing they think about is the electricity and power crisis, the deficit that South Africa is facing right now, and the lack of investment that happened over a long period of time. One can argue that it went back to 1998. How do you feel about the trajectory that the government is on in terms of arresting that situation now?
What needs to happen with regard to electricity? One of the things that must be done is the renovation of the coal-fired power stations. Everybody says they are very old, and that is correct. They are very old. Machines are machines. They will wear down. So what you do, apart from ordinary maintenance, you need renovation of the stations. So you put in new money to renovate them, and indeed the capacity, the possibility is that to do that renovation now. It needs to be done. Clearly there needs to be very movement with regard to the renewable energy side of this thing. So we need to move on both of those. The part of the challenge with regard to the renewables is that then you need the grid to build the grid for the Northern Cape in order to feed into the national grid and so on. The interventions are not complicated to conceptualize. But as I say, for instance, the renovation of the power stations, it can be done. There are companies that are on standby today ready to do that renovation so that your coal-fired power stations are producing at maximum electricity energy available factor of a very high thing through that process of renovation.
Let me ask you this to wrap this part of the conversation. What is the tenor of this conversation that we're having say about the upcoming election in South Africa, right? There's going to be a lot of politicking. These issues will obviously be part of that conversation. How do you see this playing out in the months ahead? Will you be campaigning for the African National Congress?
No, see, really, I think all of us as South Africans need to be focusing on these very challenges. Reduction of levels of unemployment, reduction of the levels of crime, service delivery at the local level, things of that kind. Now we need to attend to these things now. Then we'll see what happens during the elections next year. The major challenge faces the population is not who wins the elections next year. The major challenge facing the people are these things. We want electricity on a regular basis. We want the service delivery at local levels. We want somebody dealing with these crimes who are terrorizing the communities. Those are the things that the population are talking about. And I'm saying that let all of us as South Africans engage all of these are common tasks. Engage these things, and then we'll see what happens in terms of the elections next year.
A couple more questions before I let you go, Mr. President. When we talk about Zimbabwe, your name does often come up, right? It tends to be synonymous in the South African context. We've had another disputed election. Observer missions have voiced their concerns. How do you see this process? How should this process play itself out?
Well, I really don't know. This time I have not been very close to these Zimbabwe processes, but as far as I knew, after the SADC observers had made their comments, virtually saying, as far as we are concerned, these elections were not representative of popular opinion, and submitted their report to the chair of the SADC organ, President Hichilema of Zambia. I don't know what happened after that. Because I would presume that then the SADC organ would have had to study the report and make a decision or suggestion as to what is to be done. I mean, you remember when after the 2008 elections, which were very disputed, and then the second round of the presidential elections marked by a lot of violence. After that, the Zimbabwe parties agreed that really the only way to respond to this reality is that they must come together into a government of national unity. It was a response to what had happened in the elections. Well, as I said, that I was very directly involved in those particular processes. I've not been now in terms of Zimbabwe, so I can't say this is what I think should happen. But I'm saying in 2008, when the Zimbabweans themselves could see that the elections had not produced a winner, the best thing to do, let's get together as Zimbabweans for 5 years and see what we can do together. That kind of approach, I think, if one says, I'm a leader of the people of South Africa, what must inspire you is not my personal position as ANC president or president of the Republic. When I had to leave in 2008, it was to say what would be in the best interest of the country.
Right.
The decision of the ANC was wrong. To say I must leave, I knew that, and I said so publicly. They based themselves on a wrong opinion expressed by a judge in a court, and the Supreme Court of Appeal rebuked the judge and said he never should have never said things like that. I knew that. But in the interest of what happens to South Africa, I thought it was best that to say, let's go along with this wrong decision. Because not to have said no, to say I'm not going, would have created an enormous crisis. I'm just saying that I think people are holding political positions. I lead the people of South Africa. I must act as a leader, same as the leaders of the people of Zimbabwe. What is in the best interest of Zimbabwe in a situation of this kind? That's how I would have approached the matter.
So final question for you, Mr. President. Despite the negative tenor around some of the challenges that South Africa faces, some of the bright sparks tend to happen on the sports field. You will remember in 2007, you were hoisted, I believe, by the Springbok team after winning the 2007 World Cup. There's another opportunity again in France under Siya Kolisi that the Springboks could again do this. They have a big game against Ireland. Mbeki magic back in France, might that help them lift this trophy again? Your thoughts?
Yes, you are right. I mean, we're back in France, and the Springboks won the World Cup in France. And I don't think there's any particular reason why they shouldn't do the same. I have a lot of confidence in the Springboks, this particular team, including its captain, including its coach. And I really do think that they can do very well and retain the World Cup. The fact that they've come back to France should itself serve as inspiration. Because, in the final in France in 2007, which was final against England, the same way it was final against England in Japan, the whole of France came behind South Africa, behind the Springboks. Well, the French team this time is very strong.
Yep, they beat New Zealand in the opening match.
Yeah, very strong.
Home team advantage.
So what would happen in the final, I don't know. It would be problem. There would be problems for me if it was the Springboks against the French. But I think there's no particular reason why the Springboks can't win. I think, and we must all support them. We must support them because it's a very, very good team, and I think it can succeed.
Mr. President, as always, thank you for sharing your insights with us. We certainly do appreciate it. Good to see you.
No, thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you, sir. Former President Thabo Mbeki speaking to us in his capacity as the African Union chair of the high-level panel, on illicit financial flows from Africa. Of course, his intervention well received at the high-level meeting on financing for development. Of course, money at the center of the conversations here around SDG implementation and a few other topics that we covered. Hope you enjoyed that discussion. Back to you, Bongiwe, in studio.